You wouldn't believe me if I told you that the clean white rooms of NASA once hid a Soviet accent. It started out like any other assignment until it didn't. They called it a liaison role, a desk job in the shadow of rockets, where my biggest enemy was boredom. But boredom never lasts long when Moscow decides to sit in your front row. I've seen files disappear before, but not from a launch pad. I've smelled fresh paint and thought someone was hiding something. That week, in Florida, the lies smelled like jet fuel. We were trained for everything except that. Looking back, I don't regret the silence I broke. I regret the silence everyone else kept. And maybe that's why I'm telling you this now, before the file is dust, and I am too, before I regret saying any of this. Hit that like button. Subscribe if this is already making you uncomfortable. And tell me what city you're watching from, and what time it is. I like knowing where in the world people still dare to listen to secrets like these. The morning air in Florida felt sticky, even in December. I remember brushing the condensation off my jacket as I walked toward the press section, wondering why the hell the CIA needed me sitting among journalists when my clearance badge could have put me closer to the launch team. They called it liaison duties, which meant keep your mouth shut, watch for anything strange, and send a memo nobody would ever read. The bleachers were crowded with local reporters, foreign correspondents, and a few military observers. Everyone looked bored. Too many launches had dulled the magic. But one seat caught my attention. It wasn't the seat itself. It was the man in it. Civilian clothes, USAF accreditation clipped to his collar, and a camera on his lap. Not once did he raise it. I've been around enough liars to know when someone's pretending to blend in. He wasn't watching the rocket. He was watching us. At first, I thought maybe he was just another bureaucrat, someone with access but no real purpose. Then I noticed the detail. His badge looked too new, the ink too fresh, like it had been printed yesterday. And he didn't take notes. He didn't fumble for batteries. He sat perfectly still, hands on the camera as if posing for a photo that never came. The press row was noisy. Journalists talking shop, NASA handlers explaining schedules. He didn't interact with anyone. When a photographer leaned over to ask if the light was good enough, the man didn't answer right away. He seemed to study the question itself before replying with a flat, polite smile. It was the kind of pause that told me he was translating. In his head, not reacting like a native speaker would. That should have been the end of it. I could have dismissed him as just another stranger with a badge. But the seat stayed empty the next morning. Launch rehearsals had the same crowd, same reporters, same badges flashing in the sun. Except him. He wasn't there. I asked NASA's press liaison if they noticed anyone missing. They shrugged. People come and go. Later that afternoon, I saw the man again inside a restricted hangar, nowhere near the press section. He walked past a guard like he'd done it 1,000 times. No one stopped him. Maybe the badge opened the door. Maybe someone let him through. Either way, I knew right then my boring assignment had just become something else entirely. And that was the last time I looked at a press badge and thought it meant journalist. It was the kind of hallway where every sound carried too far. NASA built those buildings for machines, not conversations. I was walking behind him, the man, from the press row when I heard his voice for the first time. At first, it was flawless, clear English, every syllable in place. But I'd spent too many years in Berlin not to hear what others missed. His intonation was too balanced, too careful, like a metronome. No slips, no casual contractions, no drawl. That wasn't a voice that grew up in Chicago or Boston. It was learned. Built. He stood near a vending machine, chatting with 2 junior engineers. They asked which paper he worked for. He didn't hesitate, just smiled and said, "Freelance for Europe." The words rolled out flat, as if he practiced the sentence 100 times in front of a mirror. The engineers nodded politely, but I caught the flicker of doubt in one of them. Nobody knew him, and in that place, everyone knew everyone. Later, I passed him in the cafeteria line. He held the tray wrong fingers stiff, like he wasn't used to it. I know it sounds trivial, but spies reveal themselves in details. He avoided eye contact until he noticed me looking. Then he gave a polite nod, like neighbors passing on a quiet street. I'd seen that gesture before, neutral, non-committal, the kind designed to be forgotten 5 minutes later. Still, he wasn't perfect. When another reporter joked about getting a better seat for the fireworks, he didn't laugh right away. He studied the room before offering a chuckle. That kind of delay might not mean much to most people, but to me, it was confirmation. He was calculating every move, even his laughter. I told myself not to overthink it. My job wasn't to interrogate accents. But the more he spoke, the more obvious it became. He didn't stumble like a foreigner. He erased himself like one. And sometimes, erasing yourself says more than words ever could. That should have been the end of my suspicion. A note in a report, nothing more. But a week later, when the launch rehearsals tightened security, I heard his voice again, this time on the wrong side of a locked door. I sent a request to Langley, the old-fashioned way typed. Memo, couriered up the chain, filed under possible foreign presence. Most of those ended up in a drawer, but to my surprise, someone actually answered. The reply came back thin. No known match in the Soviet personnel database. That should have calmed me down. Instead, it made the itch worse. I couldn't let it go. In Berlin, I'd learned the value of unofficial files, the ones analysts passed around over cigarettes, the sketches nobody stamped. I asked a friend in counterintelligence to run the man's face against old composites. 2 days later, I got a quiet call. We don't have him, but we might have his shadow. What came through the fax was grainy, like someone had drawn from memory after a bad dream. The features were close enough to set my teeth on edge. Square jaw, sharp eyes, that same polite blankness I'd seen in the cafeteria. Underneath, a single word, Železniak. Iron. No first name. No confirmed identity. Just whispers from Prague. A sighting during a failed exchange. No arrests, no follow-up. I sat with the sketch in my hands, staring at a ghost. Langley dismissed it as inconclusive, but I knew the bureaucracy too well. Inconclusive was code for "we don't want to touch it." I folded the paper and slipped it inside my notebook, away from the eyes of NASA handlers, who would have laughed if I told them their press guest might be KGB. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the vehicle assembly building, I walked past the press area again. He was there, same seat, same camera on his lap, staring at the launch pad as though memorizing it line by line. The sketch burned in my pocket. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was paranoia. But I couldn't shake the thought. How many times had Iron sat in someone else's front row before they noticed him? And if he was here, staring at our rockets, then what the hell was he waiting for? The hangars smelled of grease and dust, nothing like the polished control rooms that ended up in photographs. I'd grown used to that smell that clung to your clothes, a mix of old machinery and Florida humidity. That's where I saw it, a slim aluminum case tucked neatly behind an auxiliary control panel in Hangar 3. It wasn't unusual for journalists to leave bags around, but they usually carried notebooks, spare lenses, tape recorders. This one was different. The label read "Press Equipment," stenciled in block letters, but the paint looked off, like someone had done it in a rush. Nobody questioned it. Technicians stepped around it as if it belonged there. The man with the too perfect English left it every morning and collected it every night. Except one afternoon when he didn't. I waited until the area cleared and pulled the case out. It was too light for cameras. The lock was nothing special. By the time I pried it open, the contents were gone. Only 2 things remained: punched card, edges frayed, and a thermal paper schematic curling in the damp air. No camera, no microphone, no tools. Just the kind of artifacts that didn't belong anywhere near a press gallery. I slipped both items into an envelope and filed a quiet note to my contact. Hours later, when security swept the hangar, the case itself had vanished. Not checked out, not logged, simply gone as though it had walked away. I'd seen documents disappear from desks in Berlin, cars vanish from safe houses in Vienna, but never equipment under NASA's nose, inside a supposedly secure hangar. I stared at the empty space where the case had been and wondered how many people had walked past it without blinking by nightfall. The envelope was already on its way to Washington. I didn't know if I'd ever see those scraps again. All I knew was that the game had shifted. We weren't just being watched anymore. Someone was already reaching inside. And once a hand gets inside, pulling it back out is never simple. The envelope came back marked internal use only. That usually meant I wasn't supposed to open it, but I did. Inside was the punched card I'd sent, now accompanied by a typed sheet with 3 lines of analysis. That was all Langley gave me for weeks of waiting. The card, they said, matched. A subroutine buried in the Apollo guidance system. A correction algorithm for mid-course trajectory. On paper, it was harmless, just math. But in practice, it was part of a classified experiment. Early AI logic running inside the command nodule. A test to see if the machine could anticipate pilot error. No one outside the immediate flight circle even knew it existed. That was what froze me. If this man had access to that card, it wasn't just a matter of eavesdropping. He had touched something sacred, something still debated in closed-door sessions at Houston and the Pentagon. That program was the kind of secret people lost careers over just for mentioning. I thought about how he left the card behind, almost casually, as if he wanted it to be found. That didn't make sense. Spies don't drop breadcrumbs unless the trail leads somewhere useful. I asked myself whether we were meant to see it, meant to panic, meant to start chasing shadows while he worked somewhere else. I pressed the sheet flat and read the analyst's final line. No impact to mission integrity. Recommend no further action. That was the way Washington liked to end problems, with a stamp. But standing on that launch pad days later, watching technicians bolt panels shut, I couldn't shake the idea that we'd just been tested. Not compromised, not sabotaged, tested. Someone across the ocean had measured exactly how close they could get before alarms went off. And alarms hadn't gone off. Not loud enough. The card sat in my desk drawer after that, a silent reminder that the breach wasn't hypothetical anymore. We'd been read from the inside, and I couldn't convince anyone that mattered. I learned something then. Sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't what's stolen. It's what you don't realize has already been copied. 3 weeks later, I picked up a French newspaper in a hotel lobby. Buried between election coverage and theater listings was a single photo that stopped me cold. It showed the Apollo command module, still in assembly, wires exposed, scaffolding wrapped around it. The angle was all wrong shot from inside. Restricted bay, the kind of view even most NASA staff never saw. The caption credited to a photographer named P. Turov. I checked the accreditation list. No Turov, no freelance badge, no visitor log, nothing. He didn't exist. And yet, there it was, printed for the world. I cut the photo out and studied it under the dim light of my motel desk. The detail was perfect too. Perfect. The rivet lines, the panel seams, even the serial markings were visible. Whoever took it hadn't just snuck into a room. They'd chosen the exact shot that revealed the maximum information without looking suspicious to casual readers. Brought it to my supervisor. He glanced once, shrugged, and muttered, "Publicity stunt. Probably a leak from the press office." Then he slid the clipping back across the table like it was nothing. But his eyes betrayed him. He knew it wasn't routine. He just didn't want to file the paperwork. That night, I pinned the photo above my desk, next to the sketch of Zhelezniak. Together, they told a story that no report would capture. A phantom reporter, a vanished case, a punched card, and now a photograph from the inside. I thought about the men in Houston who swore the program was airtight. I thought about the analysts in Washington who told me to stop chasing ghosts. And I thought about how easy it had been for a phantom named Torov to show the world what we thought was hidden. Some stories get printed once and forgotten. Others never stop echoing in the margins. This one, I realized, was just beginning to. Write itself.vienna was always noisy with whispers. That's where the first confirmation surfaced. A thin sheet of decrypted text pulled from a KGB channel. I didn't see the original. Only the analyst's copy that landed in my hands through a friend who trusted me more than his own boss. The message was brief, surgical. The alteration succeeded. No impact, but access validated. Project America advancing. It was the kind of line that made your stomach tighten. They weren't boasting about sabotage. They were bragging about entry. They had slipped a hand inside the glove, tested the fit, and pulled it back out clean. I rushed it up the ladder, expecting questions, maybe an investigation. Instead, I was told to wait. Days later, the only thing that came down was silence. Then I heard the sheet had been burned, personally ordered, destroyed by a Pentagon supervisor whose name I won't repeat. No photocopies, no filing, not even a summary note, just ashes. That was when I learned how fragile evidence could be. A single order, a matchstick, and an entire breach turned into a rumor. I asked myself who benefited more from that fire, Langley, the Pentagon, or the Soviets. Irony was bitter. We chased Soviet operatives across Europe for scraps of intel. Yet when one landed in our hands, our own side erased it. The reason didn't matter. National pride, bureaucratic panic, political shielding, it all looked the same from where I sat. I kept the memory of that sheet in my head. The phrasing of those lines burned clearer than the paper itself. No impact, but access validated. It rang like a warning bell, and the longer I thought about it, the more I wondered. If they'd validated access once, why would they ever stop there? I walked into mission control with the clipping in my pocket and the burned message still etched in my memory. The consoles glowed, rows of engineers bent over headsets, all rehearsing for the launch, as if nothing in the world could touch them. I asked to see the flight director. He barely looked up from his notes when I told him what we'd found. His answer was as polished as the floor. "You're out of your lane, Agent. Stay in the press section." Then he scribbled something on a pad and slid it toward an aide. Within hours, I received transfer orders. No discussion, no explanation, just a clean removal from anything resembling access. That told me everything I needed. Houston knew. Not just about the photo or the card, but about the game being played right under their noses. And instead of tightening the perimeter, they built a wall of silence. I was the loose wire they needed. Cut. I spent the rest of that evening staring through the glass at the launch pad, the rocket lit like a monument against the night sky. Around me, the chatter was about countdowns, fuel ratios, telemetry. Nobody said a word about infiltration. Nobody dared. That was when it hit me. This wasn't about what the Soviets had stolen. It was about what NASA refused to admit. Pride. Politics. The need to keep the space program spotless. Those things weighed more than the truth. I walked out of mission control that night with the quiet knowledge that the breach was real, and that the only response from Houston was to bury it. And sometimes the quietest rooms are the ones that hide the loudest lies. Years later, Berlin. Different city, same shadows. I was sifting through a stack of photographs from a Stasi raid routine cross-checks. Nothing I expected to matter. Then I saw him. The face had aged, fuller around the jaw, hair thinner, but the eyes were the same. That flat, unreadable stare I'd first caught at Cape Canaveral. The file identified him as a consultant on Soviet meteorological satellites, attached to programs that tracked atmospheric data. On paper, it was science. But anyone who'd been in the trade knew what that meant. Cover for surveillance, dual-use technology, and training to see what others missed. I stared at the photo for a long time, half expecting him to blink back. He had no camera now, no aluminum case. Just a faint smirk frozen in black and white. The Stasi file listed him under another alias, but I didn't need the name. It was him. What unsettled me most wasn't his presence in the program. It was the implication. He hadn't been a lone operator drifting through our launch sites. He'd been cultivated, transferred, reassigned like a piece on a board we never saw until too late. I closed the file and looked at my own reflection in the glass pane of the office. For a moment, his face and mine overlapped, two men staring. Back one who watched from the bleachers, and one who failed to stop him. And I realized then, the Soviets weren't just watching the skies. They were studying how we watched them. Back in the archives, I managed to pull an old logbook from the Apollo flights. Most of it was boilerplate checklists, timings, the kind of paperwork that lulled even analysts to sleep. But buried deep in the engineering notes was an entry that didn't fit. A fractional deviation in one of the docking algorithms. It was tiny, the sort of adjustment a technician might dismiss as rounding error. But the notation carried a flag. Trajectory correction algorithm duplicated. That word duplicated stuck out. In flight records, nothing gets duplicated without a reason. I traced the entry through the chain of reports. Every follow-up insisted. No mission impact, no safety concerns, nothing to see. Yet the data showed a copy of the original code running in parallel, hidden like a shadow inside the system. It didn't interfere. It just listened. That realization chilled me more than sabotage would have. Sabotage makes noise. Copies stay silent. Whoever slipped that card into circulation hadn't aimed to break the mission. They'd wanted to see the machine think, to pull our logic out piece by piece. I thought of the aluminum case, the missing photo, the burned message. They weren't random. They were probes, each one pressing further, testing limits, and we hadn't stopped them. We'd handed them the keys and then filed the evidence away under no impact. I closed the logbook and ran a hand over the cover, as though I could erase the entry myself. But the shadow was still there, coded into history. And if they could clone one line of code, what else had they already copied, quietly, invisibly, while the rest of us kept our eyes fixed on the launch pad? In 1974, a quiet memo circulated through the corridors at Langley. No fanfare, no press release, just a list of personnel changes buried under routine transfers. But one name jumped out, a senior NASA officer, stripped of clearance and escorted off-site. Official reason: procedural irregularities. Unofficially, it meant somebody up high had pointed a finger. I asked around. Nobody spoke plainly, but the whispers painted a picture. This officer had access to flight protocols, to the very algorithms that had somehow ended up mirrored in our systems. He wasn't accused of passing them, not directly. But how else would the Soviets know where to look? Nobody outside a handful of rooms even knew those subroutines existed. It's easy to blame a ghost in the press gallery. Harder to admit the Breach started inside the house. When I pressed for confirmation, I got the same line over and over. Not your concern, Agent. The kind of phrase designed to end conversations before they began. I knew the pattern well. I'd seen it in embassies, in military bases, in too many cities across Europe. When the rot comes from the top, the cleanup never reaches the report. They called it discipline. I called it betrayal. The man vanished from the rosters. His name was never spoken again, not even in the classified briefings. But the timing lined up too perfectly with the photograph, the card, the altered code. The Soviets hadn't guessed. They'd been guided. And once you realize someone inside opened the door, the question stops being if it happened again. The question becomes how many doors were still unlocked. Launch day looked like celebration. Streamers, camera crews, families in folding chairs. The kind of spectacle designed to make the country forget every rumor, every whisper. I sat in the press section, tie loose, eyes on the crowd instead of the rocket. And there he was, man with a camera he never used. He didn't cheer, didn't stand, didn't even blink at the countdown. When the engines ignited, the bleachers erupted. People hugged, waved flags, shouted over the roar. I kept my gaze locked on him. He slipped away in the noise, blending into the chaos like smoke in a storm. By the time the rocket pierced the clouds, he was gone. No one stopped him. No one even noticed. I filed my report, sent it through the usual channels. Weeks later, it came back with one line: no further action required. That was the end of it for them. For me, it was the moment I understood how silence wins. The truth is, we didn't lose ground in space because of faulty machines or missed calculations. We lost it the day we stopped looking at the floor while staring at the stars. A spy had walked into our launch, and the only witness was me. Even now, when I watch documentaries about the Apollo era, I hear the applause, see the confetti. But I also remember the empty seat, the vanished case, the face in the crowd that didn't belong. And I know part of that sky was never ours to claim. I never kept souvenirs from my assignments. No badges, no maps, no fragments of tape. But that launch, what I saw there, stayed lodged somewhere deeper. You could call it memory, or maybe just unfinished business. The files are long gone now. Burned, boxed, sealed, whatever trick they used to bury embarrassment. The faces are older, or dead, or living under names that were never theirs to begin with. And me? I'm just the last fool left willing to say it out loud. Some nights, I still hear the crowd cheering, engines rattling the glass, confetti falling like a second sky. And behind all that noise, the silence of a man slipping out the back with our future in his hands. You don't see that part in the documentaries, but I did. And that's enough. Enough.